Welcome, everyone. We would like to welcome you again to this second day of our webinar of the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. Before we move on with the first session and of the day and first session of our webinar, I just wanted to remind you of the rules that are actually now you can see written in the screen. This webinar today will last until 8. We'll have a session 3, and we'll move then to a roundtable, and we will finish with the concluding remarks of our UN Special Rapporteur. And you can ask at the end of each session, the roundtable, there will be 15 minutes dedicated to questions and answers. And we'd like to ask you to please send all your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure they reach the moderator and the panelists. I now would like to give the floor to our UN Special Rapporteur Trafficking in Persons, Maria Grazia Giammarinaro. Maria Grazia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you. So just to say thank you to the participants, to the speakers and the moderators, to say thank you to On the Road. We have organized this webinar in cooperation with On the Road, which is one of the most experienced NGOs in the field of services to victims of trafficking, among other things. And I would like to thank again the city of Palermo, and particularly the mayor, Professor Leoluca Orlando, who was with us yesterday and who participated actually very actively also to the discussion by chat. Yesterday the discussion was very rich and I found this very inspiring. I would like to mention just a few things that just to not open the discussion, but anyway to pave the way to the discussion of today. In particular, what I found really interesting is the idea that states have obligations, a very wide range of obligations going much beyond the Palermo Protocol and stemming from other international treaties, from the due diligence principle, from case law, and of course, it is important to understand all the implication of this approach. Another thing I found really inspiring is the idea of the residence status, the residence permit, as a right, not as something completely discretionary as in the current situation, and in particular as a remedy, which means that the denial of this should be justiciable, that there should be an appeal, a possibility to appeal a decision of a refusal of residence permit, which is of course very often connected with assistance and support. We have learned that it is necessary probably to overcome the traditional opposition between voluntary business voluntary schemes and government imposed obligation, in the sense that every actor should do their best in their own spheres, and probably we should reflect and reconsider and revise a bit this traditional opposition. Last but not least, the non-punishment. The non-punishment, I would like to recall what has been said yesterday. The non-punishment is the use and abuse of trafficked person is systemic. It's systematically put in place by traffickers. So it is not something that can happen. It is something that happens on a regular basis. So we need to further elaborate on this.
For the next hour and a half or so. I'm sorry.
There is someone not muting the microphone. And finally, the link between exploitation and discrimination. This is just a few inspiring ideas coming from the discussion yesterday. But I very much look forward to the third session today and the final roundtable. And again, welcome everybody.
Thanks so much, Maria Grazia. And now we move on to our third session of the webinar. It will be moderated by Professor Geneviève LeBaron, who is a professor at the University of Sheffield, and it's a global renowned expert on trafficking and forced labor in global supply chains. Geneviève, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Clara. Thank you so much to the organizers for hosting us and for the work that lies behind this important gathering today and yesterday. As Clara has said, my name is Geneviève LeBaron, and I have the privilege to moderate the distinguished panel today entitled Human Rights of Trafficked and Exploited Persons Beyond the Palermo Protocol. And as the Special Rapporteur has mentioned, it's such an important moment to be here together, looking at questions of how to best safeguard the human rights of trafficked and exploited persons in the global economy. So I'm keen for us to dive straight in. I will briefly introduce all four panelists, and then the format for this session will be dynamic. It will run as a moderated conversation with me posing questions to each panelist, and each panelist will have around 10 minutes to share their perspectives and expertise, and at the end we'll have questions and answers. So to begin with the introductions, first we have Ambassador Louis C. de Baca, a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School and former United States Ambassador at Large on Trafficking. Ambassador de Baca led US government activities in the global fight against contemporary forms of slavery during the Obama administration. As Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, he updated statutes to develop the victim-centered approach to modern slavery that has become the global standard for combating human trafficking. Welcome, Lou. Next, we have Mike Dottridge. Mike is an independent human rights expert who has worked in the human rights field for 4 decades. He was employed by Amnesty International and Anti-Slavery International, where he was director from 1996 until 2002. Since 1995, he's focused on the rights of adults and children subjected to economic or sexual exploitation, working independently since 2002, undertaking evaluations and institutional learning exercises for both international organizations and for NGOs. Mike was one of the international experts convened to contribute to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights' recommended principles and guidelines on human rights and trafficking. Welcome, Mike. Third, we have Maud de Boer Buquicchio. She's a Dutch jurist and was a special rapporteur on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography from 2014 until very recently, just a couple of months ago, I believe, in 2020. She served as Deputy Secretary General of the Council of Europe from 2002 to 2012 and was the first woman elected in this post. She's a member of the Board of Directors of the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a global nonprofit organization that combats child sexual exploitation and pornography, and was elected President of Missing Children Europe in 2013. Welcome, Maud. And finally, we have Christine Chenkin. Christine is Emerita Professor of International Law, also a Professorial Research Fellow, and founding Director of the Center of Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics. She's a barrister. She's held visiting appointments around the world, such as in Australia, the United States, Singapore, and the People's Republic of China. She's currently a member of the Kosovo Human Rights Advisory Panel and was scientific advisor to the Council of Europe's Committee for the drafting of the Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. She was a member of the working group that drafted the OHCHR recommended principles and guidelines on human trafficking. Welcome, Christine. So a warm welcome to all 4 of you and to everyone who's here to participate in the discussion. let's begin, and I will just remind each panelist to please try to keep their contribution brief because we have just over an hour remaining in our session, including the Q&A. To help stick to time, I have prepared these colorful notes. I will hold this one up with a 1-minute warning, and then this red one will be the 0-minute warning to ask you to please wrap up so we can move on to the panelists and ensure that we have time for the Q&A. Okay, if I may start with you, Lou. You've had a lot of experience concerning the implementation of the protocol worldwide. Reflecting on that, could you tell us what are the main elements of evasion or reversion of international norms by state authorities? And do you think that a genuinely human rights-based approach can contribute to improving criminal justice responses?
Thank you, Geneviève, and everyone on this wonderful panel. I'm going to try to be quick because I'm excited about hearing these great other panelists. I think that it comes down to a couple of things, and I will maybe point out a few common areas that we see of evasion, but then I think perhaps hone in a little bit on kind of what that looks like 20 years on. To do that, though, I think we have to think about at least what some of us were hoping for in the Palermo Protocol in the first place. And at least for the United States, what we were doing as we were revising our own anti-slavery laws, and they were anti-slavery laws, not anti-trafficking laws in the United States, is that we were trying to make sure that people who were subjected to sexual slavery, often in prostitution, but not always, were basically covered by the rights guarantees of the slavery approach. Because for 100 years, you basically had an international regime that stood outside of any of the human rights developments. It perhaps had the rhetorical flourish, calling itself white slave trafficking. It hid behind the idea of it being a horrible moral offense against womanhood and frankly, whiteness. But what it did is it basically failed to challenge the security interests of the states. And it was a very comfortable thing. And for 100 years, it basically, frankly, hurt a lot of people. It hurt migrant women, it hurt men in migrant communities, it hurt men in minority communities, it hurt even majority population women and sexual minorities who were engaged in prostitution or engaged in migrant prostitution. And so one of the things that we started doing in the 1990s was applying our anti-slavery laws, the 13th Amendment, and the statutes that came out of it. We started applying that to prostitution cases where people were enslaved, because we figured the framers of the 13th Amendment were trying to get rid of all of the vestiges of slavery. And one of those, of course, was widespread sexual abuse and sexual enslavement. And so that it made sense. Now, in doing that, what we realized is that we were bringing them under this rights-based approach, and we were seeing them, we didn't use these words, but I think 20 years later, you would now think of that as we were seeing them as rights holders. And the Palermo Protocol, I think, at least for the United States, was where is something that's moving so that we could get it done quickly, and that was in the Transnational Organized Crime Convention. And frankly, where is something that has political will, action-oriented agencies, and a place that actually gets things done. And because what we were seeing in the late 1990s was that while the tools of human rights work, the fact-based shining a light on things and acting against them was something that was very powerful against governments who were responsive to those nudges, but wasn't necessarily something that would penetrate through to other governments. And so that idea of harnessing the political will and the power and the action-oriented nature of the law enforcement seemed like the place to be. I'm going to say two things about evasion, and then I think I'll wrap up with how this has transformed from that. What we saw in the Palermo Protocol with the 3P formulation was to say that protection and prevention should be co-equal with prosecution. That is not to say that they should exist in lieu of prosecution. And in fact, I would argue that one of the things that we see around the world is that lack of access to justice by minority and other excluded communities is itself a human rights violation. If you can't call the police and access justice in your village or in your ethnic community, but the powers that be can, that is how the status quo replicates itself. On the other hand, there's a negative aspect to that, which is that so often law enforcement's job is to come in and hurt you. And so that, I think, is the balancing act of the Palermo Protocol. I think it's something that we have to work on all the time. It's something that we've been trying to work on for the last 20 years. And it's the human rights rapporteurs, not housed in the quote-unquote keeper of the protocol over at UN Office of Drugs and Crime, which so often instead simply publishes the self-congratulatory submissions that scofflaw countries will put in to try to claim that they are complying with the protocol. But it's the human rights rapporteurs who I think have been the ones that help us, quote unquote, keep that honest. Without that, the Palermo Protocol defaults over to the carceral response that I think that we were frankly trying to move away from. And finally, I think that what that does and what we see right now is the evidence is in. If you look at the United States Trafficking in Persons report, and I know that there are folks that have issues with it in various different ways, and I know that it's a report that continues to try to strive to get things right. If you look at the TIP report's own numbers, which itself knows that are flawed because you're talking about numbers that are presented by governments. In Europe itself, you're talking about 239 prosecutions for forced labor 2 years ago and only 69 last year. 80 convictions for forced labor in all of Europe and only 27 convictions for forced labor. So what is happening? 20 years on, it seems almost as though by trying to bring in sex trafficking into the protection of a slavery-based ideal that said, if you are forced into prostitution, you can be seen as a slave, as a rights holder, as someone who should be free from forced labor. And instead, it's almost as though that has now eaten the entire field. And so sex trafficking then comes in as the dominant thing. And unfortunately, what I fear and what I think that I'm seeing from last week's TIP report and from what we see around the globe is that not only then is that eating enforcement and is that eating the political responses, but it is also then chipping away at this idea of the 3 Ps, that victim protection means a non-law enforcement basis for immigration relief, that it means having the right to access justice, that it has a right to access remedy, that it means that if you are certified as a victim under the national referral mechanism, that you aren't getting deported, that there are alternatives to repatriation. Repatriation, no matter how glossy and how supportive it is cast by governments who have a repatriation policy, looks a lot like deportation, not only to me, but I think to the victims and survivors. If we are to get to the point where we can have true involvement and policy innovation coming from the survivor community, we have to think of them as partners. And that is what the 3P paradigm does. The security paradigm does not. And so my challenge to all of us is not necessarily to jettison the Palermo Protocol, but insist that the Palermo Protocol do what it said that it was going to do, to place protection and prevention co-equal with the criminal justice response. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you for being a model time abider. That was really excellent, provocative comments to kick us off. You presented some staggering numbers and brought out, I think rightly, a lot of the tensions here between rights and criminal justice and different types of exploitation, slavery, trafficking, and these are themes that I think will continue to to come out through the rest of the panel. So if I may turn now to you, Mike. In your work, you've also picked up on some of the themes that Lou was talking about around tensions between rights and policing criminal justice. You've drawn attention to inconsistencies between Palermo and other standards. Could you please tell us, in your view, what are the provisions under the Palermo Protocol that you think are not fully consistent with human rights standards? If we could start there, please.
Yes, thank you, Geneviève, and thank you, of course, Maria Grazia, for giving us an opportunity to share views today. Well, the Trafficking Protocol is a solid criminal justice instrument, isn't it? It's not a human rights treaty, but even so, it should have reflected international human rights standards that were in force at the time it was adopted in 2000, and it didn't. Despite quite strong efforts by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and others, actually the protocol undermines some existing internationally recognized standards, notably those concerning the right of trafficked children to protection and support in recovery, and of course their right to have their best interests taken into account as a primary consideration in decisions and actions by officials and others that concern them. The protocol was inadequate. It was silent on some key protection issues. It was silent on the right of a trafficking victim not to be punished for offences that they were unable to avoid committing as a result of being trafficked, what we now call status offences. It's silent on the need to listen to people who've been trafficked and take their views into account when making policy, even though it does require states to provide victims with assistance to express their views during criminal proceedings. And that silence means that anti-trafficking policies around the world are not adequately informed by victim experiences. And in terms of international law, this is particularly a problem as far as children are concerned. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has emphasized the importance of listening to children's views, taking those into account when preparing laws as well as policy. The protection and assistance provisions are weak in Article 6. It requires states only to consider implementing measures to provide for the recovery of victims. And many of us quickly concluded that the inadequacy of those protection provisions actually undermined the purpose of the protocol. In a sense, Lou has already hinted at that. But victim witnesses deprived of adequate assistance were, not surprisingly, unwilling to testify and support the criminal justice process. Now, one can claim that all these weaknesses were offset by one of the protocol's stated aims in Article 2, to protect and assist the victims of such trafficking with full respect for their human rights, and also by a savings clause in Article 14 that again refers to the obligations and responsibilities of states under international law and international human rights law. But the problem with saving clauses like that is that the policy and lawmakers translating the protocol into practice at national level just didn't pay attention to the implications. The protocol's provisions on prevention are also weak. Again, they require states to endeavor to do something, to organize research, information, mass media campaigns, and social and economic initiatives. The protocol's requirements to tackle demand were not formulated really to relate to cases that didn't involve prostitution. So it's provoked an awful lot of debate over the last 20 years and little action to deal with demand. It should have been obvious to the states concerned that although the protocol didn't ask them to review and modify their existing policies or practices that were shown to have the effect of making people more vulnerable to being trafficked, they should have done so, but they didn't. So whereas measures to prevent trafficking should in theory be based on other human rights principles, once again, the law and policymakers have almost universally ignored these. If it was taken into account, the proportionality principle that was formulated, for example, by the Human Rights Committee in its general comment on freedom of movement, this would have ruled out some of the preventive measures that have had adverse impacts for migrants and others, such as bans on women emigrating for employment abroad. There's been an acute need, in my view, for these adverse effects of action taken under the terms of the protocol to be monitored. But of course, it contains no reference to the do no harm principle or the need to monitor its effects. So yes, I think there are some weaknesses to address.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those reflections. I guess it raises the question, you touch on many weaknesses, some of which I think we'll hear more about as well from Maud and from Christine. But before we turn to them, I wonder if you could reflect on briefly on the solution here. Is this about implementation? Would better implementation of the trafficking protocol be enough to ensure a human rights-based approach to anti-trafficking, or is something more radical needed here? If you could answer in about 4 minutes, that would be great.
I'll try hard. Well, I'd like to be optimistic, but I'm worried after 20 years that the protocol is fundamentally flawed. And again, it's mainly because it's a crime-fighting treaty. It's not designed to tackle all the aspects of preventing exploitation or protecting those who've been exploited. It's not designed to take account of the specificities, for example, of child trafficking or people being trafficked to commit crime. The myth of the 3 Ps was that the protocol did go beyond crime fighting, but the lack of meaningful prevention over the past 2 decades, personally, I think it amounts to negligence. Prevention requires states to take action to ensure that the circumstances in which trafficking and exploitation occur do not arise. So public information campaigns are merely a starting point, while far too little attention has been given to social and economic initiatives to prevent, such as enhancing social protection for groups known to be disproportionately vulnerable to being trafficked, or regulating the activities of recruiters. We made a lot of attempts to influence the anti-trafficking agenda. They haven't been successful, or not enough. We've already mentioned the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recommended principles and guidelines on human rights and human trafficking, to which several of us contributed. Those were eventually, 8 years later, endorsed by the Human Rights Council. So for 8 years it was silent. And it encouraged governments in 2010 to refer to the recommended principles and guidelines as a tool in integrating a human rights approach. The principles assert the primacy of human rights. They say that they should be at the center of efforts to prevent, to combat trafficking, to protect and assist victims. And one principle emphasizes that anti-trafficking measures should not adversely affect anyone's human rights, but particularly they mention trafficking victims and also the rights of migrants, internally displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers. So published in 2002, this was a strong warning that specific action was already needed to prevent adverse impacts. My regret is that that message wasn't heard. There have been plenty of other initiatives, both at international level through some of the treaty monitoring bodies, with the appointment in 2004 of the first UN Special Rapporteur on trafficking, and with some of the regional intergovernmental organizations taking action to remedy some of the protocol's weaknesses on human rights. I'm thinking particularly of the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, and the fact that it has its treaty monitoring body, whereas the Conference of Parties to the Trafficking Protocol, the Transnational Organized Crime Convention, haven't yet set up such a treaty monitoring body, although they're now at last setting up a sort of peer group review. So yes, I have my reservations. I'd like to think that reform was possible. I suspect that rather more substantial initiatives are needed to persuade states not just to prosecute, but to take the fundamental action necessary to both prevent and to protect the victims of extreme forms of exploitation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. A lot of really important and provocative insights there for us. I think picking up on the theme of protection, we can turn now to Maud. Maud, your work has focused a lot on children, and I wonder if you could share some reflections based on your vast experience around that theme. And specifically, could you reflect on the scope of applicability of the international legal framework to child victims of various crimes, including sexual exploitation and the abuse of children in armed conflict? So thinking about the protocol and children.
Thank you very much, Geneviève. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Thank you. And thank Maria Grazia for bringing us together on this important occasion and allowing us to reflect together on the future, what is needed and what is needed more in particular to protect victims and to prevent these crimes to happen. When children are concerned, we are confronted with a multitude of offences. The list would be too long. What is really brings common to all of them is that children are treated as commodities in total disregard of their human rights and dignity. Whether we talk of sexual abuse and exploitation or labor exploitation, all of these have that in common, and the exploitation is, of course, not only about exploiting vulnerability of the children, but it's also for profit, which is the incentive for the criminals to proceed. We usually refer to these crimes as hidden crimes. I'm not sure they're hidden. I think if we want to see them, we can see them. The problem is that some of these crimes are not properly reflected in law, and there is definitely a protection gap when it comes to criminalizing all these offenses. I can talk for a second about the difference between sale and trafficking, and at the end of the day, I think perhaps the only difference, because we know about the 3 elements of the Palermo Protocol, which are 2 elements only if it's about children, only the act and the purpose. But I think what ultimately distinguishes the sale from trafficking is the commercial transaction, which trafficking does not require. So my point is that all these crimes should be criminalized, and that the prosecution should be made possible, so that children are that criminals are held accountable, and that the whole series of consequences of child protection also can start operating. I would like to give one example of an exploitative act, which has not necessarily come to the mind of the drafters of the Palermo Protocol, but since a decision of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is now also clearly covered, which is the situation of illegal adoption. It is based on a decision which was taken, I think, 2 years ago now, by the Inter-American Court. It's related to a situation where a single mother was allegedly had abandoned her child, which was not the case. Actually, 2 brothers. They were eventually put in a home, a Catholic home, and they were clearly sold to probably loving parents in the United States. But the whole sequence of illegal acts, including an act before a notary, was regarded by the Inter-American Court as a as an example of traffic with clear reference to the Palermo Protocol, and the illegal adoption was regarded as a form of exploitation. And I think that's an interesting development, because we still are confronted with situations of survivors of massive adoptions which have taken place illegally. I want to move quickly to the situation of trafficking in children and sale of children in armed conflict. We can easily have imagine the enslavement of children, the Chibok girls or the Yazidi girls who are being sold on the market with the price tag. More obvious sale than that, I don't think you can imagine. But the question arises whether we are in situations of that kind, in situations of conflict, and if it's part of a widespread systematic attack, whether this could be regarded as this enslavement could be regarded as a crime against humanity, because if it's in the course of trafficking or in the context of trafficking. So, which would mean potential jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. There are some promising signals from the indictment chamber in The Hague, but no case so far has reached at that stage, and certainly not a finding of holding criminal accountable for having trafficked or sold children with a view to exploitation. Even if very clearly international community, and Maria Grazia is one of the very clear speakers on behalf of that community, is that, for instance, recruitment and use of child soldiers is trafficking. So, still continuing on situations of conflict where children are vulnerable and likely to be subject to all sorts of violations, including sexual abuse. They are obviously entitled to justice and reparation, and more than that, assistance, because what we see often is sometimes, okay, we focus on the accountability, but we forget about the assistance. By the way, both Maria Grazia and myself, we have worked very closely together, which is obvious because the sale and the trafficking in the context of children are very, very close, as I've just explained. We have suggested that in these situations, that such acts should be linked to the 6 grave violations which are mentioned and which have been identified by the Security Council, which would entail just the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court in certain circumstances, but also bar troops from sending peacekeepers to a particular place. I have personally, and I want to pick up on really the point you have made, Geneviève, and asked me to address, the assistance. I have been addressing the review panel who was put in charge of looking at what had happened in the Central African Republic when abuse of young boys had occurred in 2014, which was basically a story of sex, food for sex and sex for food. And there were a lot of problems with identification of who had done what and why nothing had basically happened. But in all this concern, when I was asked to present some views to the independent review panel, I have really insisted a lot on the need to ensure at the same time that these children should benefit from appropriate recovery and care within the understanding within the community. So there had to be people had to work with the community, and there was definitely a flaw from that perspective. By the way, the soldiers who were eventually brought to justice, for instance, the French contingent, the soldiers from the French contingent, they were acquitted eventually because there was insufficient evidence. But I really question whether the way the children were interviewed was appropriate and age appropriate, adapted a child-friendly justice to make them understand, and so that nobody could say that there were contradictory statements. Anyway, so what matters is really provide these children with support and assistance to allow them to recover from this terrible ordeal, and I'm not reassured that that has happened so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Maud. Gosh, another theme here of assistance, protection, support, not coming through in the ways that we would want it to for vulnerable groups. We have just about 2 minutes before I would need to move on to Christine, but I wonder if we could cover briefly another aspect of your work, which is around the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking, and especially around children's rights. And if you could just share very briefly what you see is the added value of that in light of some of the other issues that you've mentioned.
Sure, thank you very much, Geneviève. There's a little echo when you speak. I hope it's not the case when I speak, but I can already thank Mike and Louise for having referred to the Council of Europe Convention, which indeed adopted 5 years after the Palermo Protocol, attempted to fill the gap, not because they felt, the Council of Europe felt that the Palermo Convention was insufficient, but simply because the whole concept of human rights and the protection of children's rights is embedded in the statutory mission of the Council of Europe. But I just want to give briefly a few points which make the difference. Of course, the monitoring machinery, an independent monitoring machinery has been extremely helpful to clarify the provisions which in itself were much more human rights and victim oriented. But the difference is also that it covers national and not only international, transnational trafficking, and it's irrelevant whether it's linked or not to organized crime. But more importantly, I think that there are a number of very important, precise provisions which go beyond the minimum standards, and that the whole convention has really a child-sensitive approach, which is reflected in the preventive measures which are elaborated, the identification of victims, and the prohibition of refoulement of a child if it's not in the best interest. And perhaps it sounds like a detail, but it is very important, the appointment of a guardian to ensure that it's precisely this best interest of the child is being protected all through the process, and the non-criminalization of the offenders. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maud. So many important points there, which we'll come back to, no doubt, in the questions and answers as well. Thank you. So now, finally, Christine, if I could turn to you. An important dimension of ensuring human rights of trafficked and exploited persons is the Security Council. And I wonder if, drawing on your vast experience, could you please share with us some of your thoughts about that, and specifically around, whether the Security Council agenda is impacting positively, negatively on a human rights-based approach to anti-trafficking, and especially given your work, whether you could look at that in the context of women's rights in particular.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you as well to Maria Grazia for the invitation to join this great panel. The Security Council is not a human rights body. I mean, let's start there. But in the context of anti-trafficking, I think there's two aspects that the Security Council takes. One is the general thematic resolutions that began in 2016, Resolution 2331. The other is anti-trafficking in specific contexts, such as, for example, with respect to migrants leaving Libya, where the Security Council has used Chapter 7 to allow action on the high seas, and made the very general point that this should not impact upon the human rights of those seeking to flee via Libya, in particular their right to claim asylum. Put that one aside, and I think the more important in this context are the anti-trafficking resolutions that are thematic under Chapter 6. And the Security Council references Palermo, urges states that haven't done so to ratify Palermo, but essentially it looks at trafficking in a particular context with a particular focus. The focus is security, and the context is threefold. It looks at conflict-associated trafficking, sexual violence associated with that trafficking, and the recruitment and financing to enhance the power and control of terrorists and those organizations that use extreme violence. Essentially, Maud's already referred to the Yazidi situation, but essentially what it's really looking at in that resolution are the offences committed against or committed by the ISIS and other terrorist groups, and the connection there with their gender ideology for the purposes of sexual exploitation, trafficking, enslavement, etc. So essentially, I would argue that the Security Council securitizes trafficking. It's a securitization approach, it's not a human rights approach. It does recognize that trafficking constitutes a human rights abuse, but beyond that, it makes no mention, for example, of any of the human rights treaties. It makes no reference to CEDAW. CEDAW is the first human rights treaty to actually include trafficking within it in Article 6. It does not urge states that haven't done so to become parties to the human rights treaties. And beyond that, although it emphasizes sexual violence and armed conflict, it doesn't recognize that sexual violence or trafficking per se as a form of gender-based discrimination or gender-based violence. And I would argue that if it did recognize trafficking as a form of gender-based violence and the multiple ways in which it is gendered in that fullest sense, then that would carry with it the entire human rights canon that has been developed since about 1992 with respect to prevention, prosecution, investigation, etc., of gender-based violence. And I think that by just talking about sexual violence, conflict, they are missing that broader perspective of gender-based violence as a violation of human rights. Just very quickly to add on as well, they talk about the needs of survivors of trafficking, particularly psychosocial needs, health needs, legal aid needs. These are not needs, they are human rights entitlements, they're economic, social rights. And I think that each time the Security Council talks about needs, they are devaluing the aspect of economic, social rights as being fundamental, not only to the rights of survivors, but also, of course, denial inequalities with respect to access to economic and social rights is one of the drivers, creators of vulnerability to trafficking in the first place.
Absolutely, super important points there around gender-based violence. Again, a reoccurring theme around socioeconomic rights. Excellent, really excellent stuff. I guess just before we turn to the Q&A, I'd be curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on some of the connections here between the anti-trafficking and then the women and gender agendas. Especially, I wonder if you see an integration between the Security Council anti-trafficking agenda and the Women, Peace and Security agenda as being desirable, or whether that's undesirable, and if so,
cautiously desirable, I think, would be my major answer. Perhaps 2 seconds on what is Women, Peace and Security, in case all listeners aren't clear. This is the Security Council agenda that stemmed from Resolution 1325, also in 2000, exactly coterminous with the Palermo Protocol. Essentially, it's an agenda for bringing women's experiences of armed conflict into decision and policy making by national and international actors. Could sum it up by saying, ask the woman question in the context of conflict, and more broadly to enhance women's human rights and access to gender justice. 4 pillars of women, peace and security: increase women's participation, prevention of sexual violence and armed conflict, protection of against sexual violence and armed conflict, and prevention of conflict, and relief and recovery. And I think what I've already said shows there's a very obvious symbiosis between the anti-trafficking agenda and women, peace and security. The focus on sexual violence and armed conflict in the Security Council's anti-trafficking agenda. So it does seem somewhat strange, I think, that these different resolutions, including the latest Women, Peace and Security resolutions, post the adoption of Resolution 2331 on anti-trafficking, are not in any way brought together. Would it be desirable? I think the pluses would be it would create a more coherent approach. It would avoid fragmentation. It would decrease this fragmentation of different legal regimes. There's a growing body of expertise around women, peace and security. We now have gender advisors, teams of experts, the special rapporteur, special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence in armed conflict, who's already looking at trafficking issues. Bring all of those people to look at the two agendas together, I think would make sense. It's same, we had a lot of discussion yesterday about NGOs and civil society. Again, to bring that expertise together across the two agendas, I think would be useful. I think it would help to recognize clearly the gendered nature of much of trafficking and the human rights dimension that everybody has been talking about. The Women, Peace and Security resolutions, the latest 2467 in 2019, explicitly incorporates CEDAW, for example. And so CEDAW could then act as a bridge between women's human rights, women, peace and security, anti-trafficking. And I think that would be extremely useful. Maria Grazia has, in one of her reports, looked at the ways in which the 4 pillars of women, peace and security could be used to inform anti-trafficking approaches. I don't want to go back over that, but I would just mention participation. It's been mentioned earlier this afternoon. And like the Palermo Protocol, the Security Council resolutions give no voice, no agency, no empowerment to victims of trafficking. One of the major themes of Women, Peace and Security is urging the participation of women in decision-making, in particular in the context of peace processes and post-conflict reconstruction. Now, we all know that the demands of the war economy, that the collapse of social structures post-conflict create a situation of greater vulnerability to trafficking at that post-conflict moment. And I think it could be extremely important if issues relating to preventing trafficking could be brought into peace agreements. This just does not happen. Maybe, possibly, greater participation by women under WPS, by traffic victims under the anti-trafficking could be something that could address that. WPS is now explicitly survivor-centered. I think that too would be useful. What are the concerns in about have I got 1 minute, as to what might be some of the downsides? WPS itself is poorly implemented on the ground, and there's concern that it doesn't do what it sets out. The transformative potential has been lost. In a way, WPS has also been securitized, and greater emphasis needs to be put on implementation, actual improving women's lives on the ground. So WPS is certainly not a panacea, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And of course, the current political situation with the backlash against gender, the abuse of so-called gender ideology, the attack on women's sexual and reproductive rights that we are seeing across women's human rights agendas generally, I think are other areas for extreme caution of seeing this as a way forward without also recognizing the challenges that are involved in that.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. So many important tensions brought out across the 4 presentations around the different Ps, around the security, gender agendas, around rights-based criminal justice agendas, lots of tensions that sort of cut across, in some ways, the presentations. That brings us to the end of our panel. I think that's really excellent complementary perspectives to start off. We've received many questions, and we have about 20 minutes now for the Q&A before we move into the roundtable. So what I would propose to do, we have the first round of questions that seems to be, there are quite specific questions for some of the different panelists. So I think if we may start with those, I'll read them out and then you could each answer the one addressed to you or not, or comment on someone else's if you prefer. And then we'll move on to, I'll give sort of 2 or 3 questions and we'll go around once more. Okay, so the first question that came in is for you, Lou. I hear that trafficking is not only sex trafficking, and I agree. I am the representative of an NGO working mainly with women, girls trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Having read the report of the Special Rapporteur on trafficking in human beings, which will be presented at the Human Rights Council in 2 days, I find a parallel. Are there not supply chains for sex workers too? Where demand is, there will be a supply. But the supply chains for persons into sexual exploitation normally are illegal in the hands of gangs and criminals. Would the right of remedy not finally mean that states would have to cover the harm done by criminals? What about punishing the sex buyers? How to access the money criminals make with their crime? And this is a question from Miriam. So I love the beginning of that question. Are there supply chains for sex workers too? We often hear about supply chains in relation to agriculture, hotels, other sorts of things, but what about sex work? So that's a question for you, Lou. Maud, we have a question for you as well. It's a slightly shorter one. Do you think the recruitment by maras, gangs present in some countries in Latin America, can be considered trafficked as aimed at the exploitation of persons in illegal activities, prostitution, etc.? Thank you. Okay, so those are the 2 that have come in specifically for Maud and Lou, but I would welcome also Christine and Mike to share your thoughts, maybe picking up on the question of demand, what should be done around demand, supply chains, and anything else you'd like to add. So I think we'll go in a reverse order than we did before, if that's okay. So starting with the women and then going to the guys. So Christine, if we could start with you, and if everyone could keep to a minute or 2, that would be great.
The only thing I would add, I'm not an expert on demand supply chains with respect to sexual exploitation. I look forward to hearing what is said by others. But what I would emphasize is the way in which wherever demand is created, particularly in the post-conflict situation, then there is a constant source of supply, particularly in women. So, I mean, take Colombia at the moment. So, supposedly in a post-conflict situation, supposedly in a situation where the peace process is going ahead. But what we have is the mines, a lot of illegal activity around the mining areas, and the sort of mix between labor exploitation and sexual exploitation around those mines and going into those areas. And I think a word that hasn't been mentioned so far, we talk a lot about exploitation, but commodification, particularly commodification of women and the demand for essentially women's bodies and women's labor to satisfy that demand.
Thank you. Maud?
I did not hear the name of the entity which was referred to in the question, but obviously, if this is getting hold of children illegally with the view to exploiting them in whatever way, this is trafficking, and that entails a whole series of duties, positive obligations on the states to prevent that from happening, and once it happens, to prosecute the offender. So the answer is yes.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you. Yes, let me follow on and talk about the maras, the gangs in Central America. But I'm actually thinking that the gangs that move drugs from one part of my own country in the United Kingdom to another part is not entirely different. So yes, trafficking may be involved. Yes, crime may be involved. I think for me, the big question is it just a question of enforcing the law, arresting all the criminals and so on? Or does the state have bigger responsibilities because trafficking is occurring? And that's where I think some of the special rapporteurs, not just Maria Grazia looking at trafficking, but the colleague who deals with contemporary forms of slavery and so on, can play a role in really in opening the eyes of some government officials when they visit as to what they could be doing to influence the incentives, for example, that are provided by gangs to mostly to young people, but it could be all sorts of other vulnerable groups. And then along the same lines, do the people, whether they're gangs or not, that traffic women, girls, and sometimes boys and men for the purpose of prostitution or sexual exploitation, do they have supply chains? Yes, of course they do. They have supply chains right at the final end of delivery when they have taxi drivers or chauffeurs or not just pimps, but a whole series of other people involved. But yes, they move people too. The complication there is that many, particularly girls and women, migrate and are helped along the way by people who help perhaps irregular migrants, but without the intention of trafficking them. It may be when only after they arrive at a destination that traffickers get hold of them. So it's can be complicated, but clearly there are supply chains, not just demand, but supply can be addressed in all these contexts.
Thanks, Mike. And finally, Lou.
First of all, yes.
I don't hear you, Lou. I don't know if it's just
Are
me.
we there? I keep getting told that I'm unmuted. Has that happened yet?
Yes, okay. Now I hear you.
Super.
Go ahead.
I think that, yes is the quick question. There are labor supply chains. There are product supply chains. The labor supply chains exist no matter what the underlying labor or services is. And in this situation, the underlying labor or services is in the sex industry. And I think that one of the things that we slice and dice at our peril, and we've been doing that a little bit on the panel because we're all coming in from the things that we've specialized in. And so, if we focus maybe more on the person, whether you want to call that person a worker, whether you want to call them a sex worker, whether you want to call them a person in prostitution, whether they are in a sexual industry or whether they're in an agriculture or something else, a lot of what we're talking about is almost identical. You're talking about something that is a combination of the service, which is a value extraction from the worker on behalf of the employer, and if you have a recruiter, they end up getting some of that value. If they're a smart recruiter, they end up getting that value over time because they've come up with, whether it's recruiting debts or what have you. You can call them a recruiter and think of them as being somebody in Nepal, for instance, telling some woman that she's going to have a job in the Gulf as a domestic servant, or you can call them a pimp who's telling a vulnerable young woman how pretty she is and how she should come and be with him and start making money for him. But you're talking about a lot of the same dynamics. These recruiters are selling hope. And whether they are somebody who's moving 20,000 people into the Gulf or whether it's a pimp who's controlling 2 or 3 women, you're talking about somebody who has figured out how to calibrate their pitch so that they are really getting into the hopes and dreams of the person that they're recruiting. But I think at the end of the day, what we're really talking about, again, is this notion of we need to have a value extraction proposition, but then on top of it, somebody who is willing to use force, threats, coercion, etc., to hold that person in compelled service. That's what moves this over. That's what makes it so that it's not simply a sketchy labor migration situation or a sketchy situation that somebody ends up getting into. And so, of course, I will always come back to this. You guys are going to laugh at what I say. Maybe when we're making all these fine distinctions, whether somebody's transported, whether they're recruited, whether they're this or that, whether it's for sex or labor, maybe we just need to focus on whether or not the person is being held in compelled service. And from that, then we can flow out. And it demands, I think, us to ask a question as to end user liability. Who is the person at the end who is then extracting not necessarily the monetary value, but another form of value from that person who was enslaved or exploited? We know the recruiter is getting monetary value. We know that the exploiter or employer or pimp is getting monetary value, but that end user, whether that person is the person who's going to a prostitute and frankly doesn't care whether that is a child, or whether it is the agricultural commodities brokers who don't care whether that tea or coffee or tomatoes were coming off of a place that was abusing them, or whether it's the buyer for a supermarket chain who just doesn't care enough to confront the reality of what happens on the high seas. So to me, it's less about saying that there is an overt demand for enslaved labor, and rather there is a demand that is expressed through the final consumer just not caring. And when they don't care, they then shift the externalities all the way back to that person, the vulnerable child, the vulnerable woman, the vulnerable man. And I think that to me is how I look at demand. And I don't look at demand as being that different, whether we want to cast it as sex or labor sectors that we find the demand in. We got to figure out how to make it so that those externalities are put on everybody who profits, whether it's from the value extraction or whether it's from the final product or services.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Really important things in that round, and I especially liked at the end there, Lou, drawing out some of the commonality of experience and the focus on profit and value extraction, which often I think get a bit lost in these conversations. So that's great to hear. So we have just under 10 minutes left, and we have still some other questions. What I would propose to do is to read 2 of those questions, and then we have a rapid fire where you each get to pick out just one point that you would like to share in response to one of them. And then I've been asked to just try to wrap it up and hand over to help to the roundtable. So the 2 questions that have come in are, one, given the limited scope of Palermo, how critical is it for countries to ratify and implement in their domestic legislation the UN Child Convention and CEDAW in order to enable effective human trafficking prevention and protection? That is question 1. The second one is around what can be done. Further to what can be done in good practice, can the speakers give us any insight as to what is around the corner in terms of greater protection and closer connections between identification of victims of trafficking and respect for their wider human rights? What can we expect particularly from the UN, for example? So again, I'll just ask each of you to just do a 1-minute kind of rapid fire reflection on either of those questions, and maybe we'll start this time with you, Lou, and go back through the other order if that's okay.
Certainly. I think I'll address the CEDAW question. You know, I think that one of the things that we have already heard with the suggestions that Christine has about women, peace, and security and other things is that ratification and adoption of things are important, but only if folks actually then bring them on board. And I think that the last thing that we want is to have a lot of unused treaties and a lot of unused conventions that basically end up being a box-ticking exercise. Frankly, I think that that is the vacuum into which the Transnational Organized Crime Convention moved in 2000, is that there had been so many conventions that everybody had ratified, all of which, you know, we had all of the tools that we needed to, if you look at it holistically, over the preceding 70 years, and yet they weren't being used. And I think that that to me is one of the things that I look at almost everything, and we'll talk about this in the next panel. I look at almost everything as to, will this actually trickle out to the folks on the front lines so that they can be empowered to recognize and help the people that they're supposed to be serving.
Thank you. Mike?
Surprise you if I say that, of course, I think at national level, implementing the measures required by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CEDAW, is vital. And without it, someone who's been trafficked, particularly a child or an adolescent girl, has enormously less protection and chance of rebuilding a decent life. So they're very important. To be rapid, then let me look round the corner. What can happen that might improve not just identification of victims, but subsequent protection? Well, basically, there's too many disadvantages to being identified in many countries. So at the moment, I don't see either the UNODC or the Conference of Parties offering ways of improving matters. I do see some regional organizations doing practical things, you know, whether it's active, the ASEAN Convention, or in Europe and the Northern Hemisphere now, the OSCE, planning to issue a new handbook about national referral mechanisms. I think some practical improvements are in the tunnel, as it were. I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens once CEDAW finalizes the general recommendation that is being discussed at the moment, and if we can push that down into the implementation stage. Because as Lou says, pieces of paper are meaningless, but of course, if it's translated into action, we can get somewhere.
Excellent, thank you. Maud?
Yeah, thank you for the, I would like to address the question on the need for ratification of the relevant instruments. Obviously that is needed. I mean, as far as the Convention on the Rights of the Child is concerned, we're basically fine with the exception of one stage, which everybody knows about. But for the optional protocol, which criminalizes a number of these forms of exploitation, that's not the case. That's not universally ratified. So there would be an additional need for more efforts to get countries accede to that additional protocol. But as other speakers have already said, it's basically all about implementation. Implementation is not just translating, yes, it is translating it into national law and practice, but what does it mean? It's not just about criminalizing. It means a lot of things which perhaps are not so obvious. It means that, for instance, I'm thinking of the need to ensure education on sexual and reproductive health, which is extremely important for prevention purposes. In particular, in relation to victims of trafficking, shelters have to be adapted and adjusted to the needs of children. They can't be put together there with adults. There's a need for a lot of training, because, I mean, during my country visits, I have come across a lot of law enforcement agents, and they simply don't know how to identify. They don't have the technique. And even if they identify, what do? How do they relate to the national referral mechanism to ensure that the child protection services enter into the picture? So it's not just a question of law, it's a question of policy, institutions. Everything has to be done, and that's what the special rapporteurs in their during their country visits can assess, and where they can also advise. So I agree with I think it was Louise who said that even if we have for the Palermo Protocol we have the state parties, but the real implementation, monitoring and advising is done by the special rapporteurs, and therefore I'm really very strongly in favor of reinforcing these institutions, including the contemporary form of slavery, and providing them the resources to do their job, because that's another major concern. Maria Grazia has done all she could. I've done all all I could, but so did my colleague on the contemporary forms of slavery. But without more support, we cannot possibly cover a global mandate seriously and really make a difference.
Absolutely. Christine, any final thoughts?
Well, I think everything I was going to say has actually just been said, and particularly, I mean, I think there's obviously implementation at the national level, but how do we get the international level to take the human rights part of the United Nations seriously, fund it properly, give it the resources that it needs, not just the financial resources, but the people resources, the time resources, rather than what we are seeing constantly, which are threats and cutbacks? And how do we also, particularly CEDAW, we'll sort of talk about, it's not just about the implementation. It's the point that the CEDAW committee has been making really strongly about the role in which stereotypes, attitudes, assumptions, particularly about the position of women, and the resistance that we are currently seeing to women's human rights generally. How do we fight back against that? And we have to realize that currently there is this black backlash that is going on. The notion of gender ideology being used and being used to react against appropriate enforcement of women's rights, girls' rights, all of those, of course, also who reject a gender binary. And I just think that implementation is a much bigger question than simply national legislation incorporation. We're talking about, I think, major resistance to trends that are very much against that. And how do we mobilize? How do we coordinate? How do we work together to challenge those reactionary forces against so much?
I think that's very well put, Christine, and a really excellent last note from our panel, I think, to start to wrap up this session. Everyone had a chance for last remarks, right? Yes. Okay, good. I just for a second panicked that I missed somebody. Well, thank you all so much. I think I've been asked to just wrap up. It's an incredible challenge to try to wrap up what was a really dynamic and also really multifaceted conversation that I think stretched across so many important issues that relate to Palermo, that relate to the future, that relate to, I think, the real challenge that's been shared with us by these experts who've been working for such a long time across many different aspects around the challenge of fully implementing the protocol in a way that upholds human rights. I'll just pull out a couple of things that really struck me before handing over to Helga Conrad, who will chair the roundtable, where I think we'll have a chance to explore a few more of these issues, and really with an eye to the future and what comes next. A few of the things that really struck me, I think, going back to the beginning of the conversation, the importance of Palermo, as Lou put it, boosting political will around the anti-slavery fight, even if there are challenges around implementation, if there's challenges around many other issues. I think looking at some of the positives and what has been accomplished, it struck me that point that there's been this political will and investment in this issue for a long time. I think, though, as the panelists have also noted, and as the Special Rapporteur has written about in her reports as well, you know, there's still quite a considerable amount of work that needs to be done. And the panelists have outlined across different dimensions of the protocol and different dimensions of their work, you know, what the challenges and the unfinished business is really around these issues. I think one thing that struck me from what Christine was saying is there's such a profound need for just even this basic further recognition that trafficking is gendered, that it's a form of gender-based discrimination and violence, and that in some ways, you know, we're still really lagging on that point. I think as Maud's work really touched on, you know, there's this need for better protections and remedy around vulnerability of children, and that's a point that just needs to be brought up again and again. Mike and Lou both picked up on how some approaches have tended to hurt particularly vulnerable communities as well. Migrant men and women, racialized communities who lack access to justice, sexual minorities, and others. And most, if not all, of the panelists picked up on the inconsistencies and tensions between, you know, some aspects of Palermo and the human rights-based approach that I think all agree is really necessary here to protect workers and victims against trafficking and slavery. And so for these and other reasons, as Lou pointed out, you know, the tools of human rights work need to be fully incorporated. We heard different perspectives from the panelists on whether that work can be accomplished through the protocol, or whether, you know, as Mike argued, the protocol is just fundamentally flawed. It's never going to be a human rights instrument. We need something new. A final question that came in during that last round when the presenters were sharing their final thoughts was, what might a new international counter-trafficking legal instrument look like? A totally new convention? What do the experts recommend? How do we capture all of these excellent reflections and move forward? And luckily, that is the key theme, I think, of the roundtable that follows this session. So it's my pleasure now to pass on that difficult set of questions to someone else, Helga Conrad, to continue this important conversation. I'll just introduce her briefly, and then I understand the organizers will somehow pass the mic to her. Helga Conrad, the next moderator, is former Austrian Minister for Women. She was also OSCE Special Representative for Trafficking in Persons, and is now head of a think tank on trafficking in human beings. Helga, over to you, and thank you all again for such a wonderful session.